Hello, my name is Curtis Jessop. I'm a research director working at the National Centre for Social Research, where I work in the longitudinal surveys team. Today I'll be presenting some findings from an analysis I have done comparing face-to-face and online recruitment approaches on the NatSem panel, a probability-based panel in the UK. I'll start off by giving a little bit of background information before going into the analysis, comparing the response rates of the two approaches and looking at differences in the sample composition, and then summing up what I think the key takeaways are. So, first on the background, and setting a little bit of context. I'm assuming most of you are aware of a general context, there being pressure for surveys to collect data more quickly and at lower cost, and that face-to-face probability-based surveys have been experiencing lower response rates and increasing costs. Alongside that, there has been a huge increase in the use of non-probability web panels for both commercial and social research, but substantial concerns about the quality of the sample that they provide. In that context, in 2015, NatSem set up the NatSem panel, which aimed to find a middle ground. By using online fieldwork and panel samples, it's able to increase speed and reduce costs relative to traditional face-to-face approaches, but is still grounded in probability-based sampling approaches to maintain the quality, and uses telephone fieldwork to maximize response rates and allow those without internet access to take part. That's really important for the types of social research that NatSem does. Since its inception, the NatSem panel has been recruited by piggyback sampling of the face-to-face British Social Attitudes Survey. However, in 2020, that was interrupted by COVID. For the first time, the British Social Attitudes Survey was run using a face-to-face approach. This paper summarises findings from comparing the sample recruited prior to 2020 using a face-to-face approach with that recruited in 2020 using a push-to-web approach. So, to look at the differences between push-to-web and face-to-face recruitment, we'll compare data collected from the January 21 wave of the NatSem panel, and this table summarises some key points on the design. We're comparing two groups, panel members recruited from the 2019 British Social Attitudes Survey in a face-to-face interview, and panel members recruited from the 2020 British Social Attitudes Survey in a predominantly web interview, although a telephone interview option was available. The target population was British adults. Fieldwork took place in January and February 2021 using a sequential mixed mode web telephone fieldwork design. Participants were sent a mixture of letters, emails and text messages to encourage them to take part. At this point, it is worth pointing out a limitation of this analysis is that it is not based on an experimental design. The face-to-face and push-to-web samples were recruited at different points in time, so the older sample will have experienced additional attrition and will be systematically older. In addition, the requirements of the studies we ran at this wave mean that they had different length surveys and therefore proportionally different incentives. However, on both of these points, the response rates we see are fairly typical, so we don't think it's had much of an impact on the results, and certainly not on the conclusions that we make. Okay, so what difference do we see when looking at response rates of the sample recruited through face-to-face and push-to-web methods? This table breaks out the response rates at each step of the recruitment process for face-to-face and push-to-web samples. The first thing to note is the substantially higher response rate in the face-to-face recruitment survey relative to the push-to-web one. The second thing we see is that of those people that took part in the recruitment survey, the push-to-web participants were more likely to agree to join the panel, and of those, they were more likely to take part in the specific panel survey that they were invited to. However, if we look at the cumulative effect of these different steps, we can see that the face-to-face approach produces an overall response rate which is around 2 times higher than the push-to-web approach, despite the higher recruitment rates and the panel survey response rates for the push-to-web sample. So, in summary, this shows us that the face-to-face recruitment results in higher response rates. In addition, most of that non-response occurs after the recruitment survey. That's important as it means that we know more about the people who do not take part in the panel survey, meaning non-response can be better modelled and adjusted for. However, the push-to-web approach is cheaper. As well as the initial recruitment survey cost being lower, the higher panel survey response rates mean that the panel survey waves are more cost efficient for people recruited using a push-to-web approach. Also, of those that took part, push-to-web recruits were more likely to take part online and less likely to take part on the phone, reducing the fieldwork costs further. Okay, so that's the difference in the response rates. What impact did it have on the sample profile? To evaluate this, we compared estimates across a set of demographic variables collected during the panel wave. What we find is there were lots of small differences here and there, but three clear patterns stood out. Push-to-web recruits were more likely to use the internet regularly, they were better off, and they were generally more politically engaged. Probably all things we might expect to find based on experience patterns of non-response in surveys and how they affect the sample profile. This set of charts just gives some illustrative data of these patterns. You can see that the differences aren't huge, but they're definitely there across several variables. Firstly, as might be expected, panel survey participants recruited from a push-to-web survey were less likely to use the internet infrequently. Secondly, in terms of being better off, we see that push-to-web recruits were less likely to not have any qualifications and were more likely to report living comfortably. We also saw similar patterns when looking at other variables, such as tenure, household income. In terms of political engagement, we see that the panel survey participants recruited through a push-to-web survey were more likely to support or feel closer to a political party. Not shown here, we also found that they were more likely to have voted in the EU referendum and also in the 2019 general election. Importantly, we find that the normal non-response weights that we apply to our panel surveys didn't fully address these differences. They remained even when we compared the weighted estimates for these demographic variables. This is most likely because, as I noted earlier, so much of the extra bias is coming from non-response at the recruitment survey, where it simply cannot be modelled as effectively. A key strength of using face-to-face recruitment is that much of the non-response occurs after people have completed that initial recruitment survey, so it can be modelled and adjusted for. That these differences remain, even after weighting, is a problem because it feeds through into our survey estimates. This particular panel survey wave looked at vaccine hesitancy, and we can see in this chart slightly higher levels of hesitancy among people recruited using the face-to-face approach. Again, it's not a very large difference, but it's a consistent pattern that we see through the data. We find that people recruited from the push-to-web approach were more likely to trust health information from the government, from the NHS, from doctors. They were more likely to find and understand COVID-19 information easily. They were more likely to say that they were following the rules of guidelines, and they were less likely to think that COVID-19 is a hoax. So, what can we take away from this? Rather than better or worse, I would say that push-to-web recruitment seems to occupy a different cost-quality position relative to face-to-face recruitment. It does look like it's lower quality, but it is also cheaper, and there may be studies where that is more appropriate. And I think it is likely to be better than a non-probability approach for an online web panel. Longer term, I think the best approach is likely to track it alongside patterns in cross-sectional surveys. If we get better sample quality from push-to-web recruitment, it may become a more viable option, either as methods are improving or as the world changes and more people are able to take part online. More negatively, if face-to-face response rates continue to decline and continue to become more expensive, they may become less viable relative to an online approach. Or, alternatively, approaches such as mixed mode designs or something else entirely may become more prevalent. For now, at NatSen, we're avoiding using this sample where possible to maintain the quality. In a typical wave, what we're doing is using the existing face-to-face sample we have, and then using the push-to-web sample to refresh our sample of 18 to 24-year-olds, where such that any impact on the overall sample quality is minimized, and where it does happen, it's for an age group who we think are less likely to be affected by the differences. Thank you for your time. and I look forward to hearing your questions.